So I've set myself a personal goal of working through this fabulous 5-yard quilt book. So far, I have made the Aurora pattern, which I loved working on. The next pattern I want to do is called Bella. Now, in the Bella pattern here, they show the bows being the darkest fabric, but actually, I want to change that up a little bit. So, for my focus fabric, the fabric that's going to go in all of these big squares, I chose this print right here. I think it's beautiful. It's got all these flowers. And then to border this and then be these little bows, I'm gonna use this pale pink. It's in certain lighting it looks different, but I just love this pale pink. I just think it's kind of a peachy pink. It kind of is about basically this color. And then there's almost like a chain going on in the background here with these little squares. I want to use these two colors. I have a green and white, and then like a dark pink with that same peachy pink in it. And that is what I want to do on all of this part where it's these squares in the background. And then there's a dark border. And so then for my dark border, I plan to use this fabric. So these are the fabrics that I have picked for my next project that I will be starting soon. I'm really intrigued by this pattern. I think it's a really pretty pattern. And then these are my colors I'm going to be using.
Spoiler alert, I ended up using 4 of those 5 fabrics, but stay tuned to see which of the 4 I used and which one I left out. It surprised me as well. The first step is to pick your focus fabric, which is your boldest print. So in this case, it's my flowers. And this 5-yard quilt pattern calls for strip piecing. So where there's large squares of florals with a border, you're not actually going to cut squares out. You're actually going to cut out a wide strip. And then you're going to cut out narrow strips of your accent fabric, and you're going to make a strip set. Making a strip set instead of cutting out squares allows this pattern to come together much quicker. It reduces the amount of seams that you have to make, and it speeds up the process. My instinct at this point was to try to subcut these down into squares. But after consulting the pattern again, I realized, no, just leave them in wide strips. Once you've added your accent fabric, the narrow strips to either side of your wide strip set, The next step is to iron. So what I did was I pressed set the seam, then I rolled the accent fabric out towards the outer edge. There's no seam matching. The pattern actually is written for you to press the seams open, but I really don't enjoy pressing seams open. So I just pressed everything towards the accent fabric to keep it consistent. Once your strip set is pressed, the next step is to subcut it. The cutting instructions are in the pattern, so you subcut this down, and then you're going to add accent strips to either side. I'm again just going to press to set the seam. Then I'm going to roll this pink fabric out and iron it with the seam underneath that bordered edge. So I'm just trying to keep my pressing consistent. And that's a completed block. Very easy. So that's block A in the quilt. And then I need to work on block B. The method of strip piecing these borders on this focus print makes it go really quickly to get this block A done. I did utilize a 5-pound hand weight to help me hold this ruler straight when cutting these very thin, narrow strips because there's not much margin for error. The other type of block in this quilt uses a snowballed corner. So you need to draw on your little accent fabric squares a diagonal line. You place that square on one of your rectangles of fabric and you stitch directly on that line. This is 100% a type of pattern where you can do chain piecing. Here, I'm adding on the snowballed corners, and I like to not approach from the corner side, but from the flat side of the block. So as you see, as I add the square, and I've already drawn my diagonal line, I rotate it so that I start from a straight edge. I just find my machine accepts it better this way. It's really easy to sit here and chain piece a bunch at one time. And so this is a really nice quilt pattern that you can just get into a groove with. And because you're doing the same thing over and over again, it goes really quickly. The main thing is the difference between the green blocks and the pink blocks are which way your diagonal line is going. So you have to be careful with that. Otherwise, your bow shape won't come out right. But as long as you're careful with which way your diagonal line is going, it's very easy. It took me a little bit of time to figure out my favorite way to iron this. I preferred to press it so that the two parts of the stitch and flip were underneath the green part, which is the darker part. Then I can trim off those edges and then you get your little unit. So again, I roll the fabric back so that all of it's underneath the green side. And then once you iron it, trim off those two extra edges. There's a little bit of waste with this quilt. When you do a stitch and flip method, when you trim off that part, there is a little bit of waste. Sometimes I add an extra line, but the part that you're trimming off is pretty small. So by the time you go a ½ inch over, I didn't feel like I was gonna have enough left to really make a good sized triangle. So you do have a little bit of waste with this quilt. But as you can see, it's very repetitive. So once you get the skill down for the stitch and flip, you can just sail through these. And I like to listen to a podcast or put a movie on in the background and just, this is very relaxing sewing to me. So these units I've already added the extra green rectangle to. Again, all the cutting and size instructions are in the pattern. As you can see, I do have the pattern out in front of me and there's really good pictures and diagrams, and I keep referring to it because while this is not hard, every single one of these green units needs to be the same way, and the pink is the reverse of this. And so you've got to make sure you're sewing your rectangle on that wider side of your little snowballed corner. And then the pink one is the reverse. And so see how those are the reverse image to each other? So I had the diagram out in front of me the entire time, the quilt pattern, just to make sure that I was doing these blocks correctly. To make the bow block, you're going to choose 2 green and 2 pink and lay them out as shown. The pattern tells you to press seams open, but I'm not a fan of pressing seams open. So what I did to make this part nest up is on the pink units, I pressed the seam towards the snowballed corner, and on the green blocks, I pressed the seam towards the solid green rectangle. That way, when I put these 2 blocks together, they would nest up and I would get a sharper bow. At this stage, I ironed the seam towards the green block on both pieces. Again, since I pressed to the green, it will nest up when I put that bow together. Now, I had to come up with my own pressing strategy, and maybe you prefer to press your seams open, so you'll be happy just to do that. But I just picked one color, in this case green, and I pressed towards the green on all of these bow blocks. You have to just come up with your own strategy and do what works for you, which is 100% my rule of everything with quilting is find what works for you and let that be your guide. How darling is this little bow block? I just think this is the cutest thing. Okay, so now the next step in the pattern is to take one of our focus prints with the border and a bow block, and we're gonna sew these together into rows. I chose to press towards the focus block because it had less seams, actually no seams there on the edge. And then that way, that was what I did consistently with all of my rows. And then when my rows went together, my rows nested because I pressed it towards that bordered block every time. I'm at this point getting so happy because I can really start to see, start to imagine how this is gonna work out. So that's it. That's the bow block. And then your focus print with your borders. It's only 2 blocks, but it makes a really darling quilt. I did decide to change the layout a little bit from the pattern. I ended up making my Bella quilt 5 squares by 5 squares. So rows of 5, 5 rows of 5. The pattern called for 6 rows of 4 and then borders. I ended up not using borders. And so technically this is only a 4-yard quilt because that light green and white, I ended up leaving it out. And I used the darker green for my bow block. So, I think the thing with patterns is it's okay to just take a pattern and then modify it for what you want to do. Now, for the back of this quilt, I have a very soft, pale pink minky fabric that I picked up, and it has a really nice texture on it. It's pretty much the exact same color as my accent fabric. I've layered it with some warm and natural batting. It's 100%, I believe it's 100% cotton batting. And I get that question a lot of, do I still use batting if I am using minky? And yes, I do. That's the favorite kind of quilt at my house, is to use batting and a minky back. Now I am basting it on the floor. I didn't use any of the spray glue this time because it was not a super large quilt. This quilt ended up 50 inches by 50 inches. And so I'm going to use my safety pins and pin baste it, and then I'm going to quilt it on my home sewing machine. This one feels definitely manageable, that I don't need to send it to a long armor. I definitely feel that I can quilt this myself at home. I think if you wanted to make a fun modification on this pattern, where I have the floral print in my bordered block, I think you could possibly use a layer cake square and just trim it down a little bit. I think that could end up working out really nice, and then you would have a different print in each one of those bordered blocks. It would definitely change the look of the quilt. And so, but my mind is already thinking about that, and I'm like, how would that work? And I'm like, I think it would work pretty well. Okay, so to quilt this, I have got it basted now. I put the walking foot on my machine. I set my stitch length to 3.5. I am using Glide thread in the color Peacock. Glide thread is my favorite thread for quilting. It just seems to go through my machine so easily, and it comes in such a beautiful array of colors. Peacock is one of my favorite colors. It's like a very pale lavender pink that just seems to blend so well. Whenever I quilt with it, it just kind of recedes, and so it doesn't stand out too much. And so it's very forgiving if your stitches are not perfect. I always like to wear my little gloves. I got these gardening gloves at Ross. They are only used for quilting. I keep them with my quilting supplies, but they have a rubberized grip to them. So it really helps when you're moving a quilt around to do this part of it, because it's 3 layers thick and it can be quite heavy and bulky. Wearing the gloves gives me a good amount of grip to help guide it through the machine, and it helps relieve some of the pressure in your neck and shoulders. Sometimes when you're doing this part of the quilting, you can have a lot of tension. Sometimes I find myself really tense. So I try to get set up where I have a good posture, wear my quilting gloves, have adequate lighting, and then as you see here, I'm just trying to move the bulk of the quilt around as I'm quilting, so that it's not pulling. I like to put this little guide on my walking foot. It's an attachment and it's adjustable. So I have it set just about an inch apart. And as I'm quilting with the walking foot, I have that little silver guide on my last line of stitching. Doing this enables me to try to keep it evenly spaced throughout the quilt. It's never going to be perfect, and this quilt is meant to be used, but using that little guide on my walking foot really can kind of help take the pressure off of choosing a design. I'm just going to quilt it about every 1 inch with a straight stitch set at 3.5. This is the most simple kind of quilting I feel like you could do. Now, because this is meant to be a baby blanket, I decided to use this blanket binding in the color Dusty Pink. Now, I had to watch a tutorial and I had to watch it multiple times because I've never used a satin ribbon blanket binding, and it was a little tricky and it didn't do a perfect job, but I will link in my description the video that I followed because it did have detailed instructions of how to miter your corners when working with a blanket binding, and it just adds another element of softness. It's just so silky, and I just think it's so feminine and pretty, and I think it was the perfect finishing touch to the Bella quilt. And here I am just zigzag stitching it on after I had finished mitering all my corners. One thing that was nice about the blanket binding is that you attach it with a zigzag, and you're attaching the front and the back at the same time. So in that case, it's a lot faster than the double fold binding that I usually use, where I typically sew it to the back of the quilt, flip it to the front, machine stitch it down. I don't know. I kind of liked using the blanket binding. It was my first time ever doing it, but I definitely don't think it'll be my last. I hope you enjoyed this quilt along on the Bella quilt, which is in the Fabric Cafe book, Fabulous 5-Yard Quilts. I really enjoyed making it, and I can't wait to gift it. And I hope that you join me for my next quilting project. Happy quilting! If you enjoyed this video, please like, hype, subscribe, and follow along for more quilting fun.